Chapter 9. Grave Events Open in the Graveyard. At 9:30 that night, Tom and Sid were sent to bed as usual. They said their prayers and Sid was soon asleep. Tom lay awake and waited. The clock struck 10, and he would have tossed in bed, but he was afraid he might wake Sid. He lay still and stared into the dark. Everything was still, so still, that the ticking of the clock was very loud. Old beams began to crack, and the stairs creaked. He heard Aunt Polly snoring. A dog howled. Tom was in agony, waiting. At last he was sure the time had stopped. He began to doze. The clock chimed 11, but he did not hear it. Then there came in his dreams, it seemed, the meowing of a cat. The raising of a neighbor's window disturbed him. A cry of scat and the crashing of an empty bottle against the back of his aunt's woodshed brought him awake. A minute later, he was dressed, out the window, and creeping along the roof, joining the woodshed. He meowed carefully once or twice as he went for signaling to Huck. From the woodshed roof, he jumped down to the ground. Huckleberry was there with his dead cat, and the boys moved off and disappeared into the dark. At the end of the half an hour, they were in the graveyard. It was a hill about a half a mile from town. It was an old graveyard with sunken graves and a crazy, crooked, old board fence around it. Tall grass and weeds were everywhere. It was creepy. A faint wind moaned through the trees. Tom feared it might be the spirits of the dead complaining of being disturbed, and the boys talked little, only whispers, for they were scared. They found the new grave they were seeking and sheltered themselves under 3 great elm trees near it. They waited in silence for what seemed a long time. An owl hooted. Everything else was dead stillness. Tom could hear the silence, couldn't bear the silence any longer. He had to talk, so he said in a whisper, "Hucky, do you believe the dead people like it that for us to be here?" Huckleberry whispered, "I wish I knew. It's awful scared-like, isn't it?" "You bet it is." There was a long pause while the boys thought about it a matter. Then Tom whispered, "Say, Hucky, do you think Hoss Williams hears us talking?" "Of course he does. At least his spirit does." Tom was alarmed. After a pause, he said, "I wish I said Mr. Williams, but I never meant any harm. Everybody called him Hoss." "A body can't be too particular how he talks about their dead people, Tom," Huck warned. The conversation died again. Presently, Tom seized Huck's arm and said, "Shh." "What is it, Tom?" The two grabbed each other with beating hearts. "Shh! There 'tis again. Did you hear it?" There now, I hear it. Lord, Tom, they're coming. They're coming for us for sure. What will we do?" "I don't know. Think they'll see us?" "Oh, Tom, they can see in the dark, same as cats. I wish I hadn't come." "Oh, don't be afraid. I don't believe they'll bother us. We aren't doing any harm. If we keep perfectly still, maybe they won't see us." "I'll try to, Tom. Lordy, Lordy, I'm afraid." "Listen." The boys bent their heads together and scarcely breathed. A sound of low voices floated up from the air at the end of the graveyard. Look. "See there," said Tom. "What is it?" "It's devil fire," said Huck. "Oh, Tom, this is awful." Some dim figures approached through the dark, swinging a lantern that threw streaks of light on the ground. Huckleberry whispered with a shudder, "It's the devil, sure enough. 3 of 'em. Lordy, Tom, we're goners. Can you pray?" I'll try, but don't be afraid. They aren't going to hurt us. Now I lay me down to sleep. Shh." "What is it, Huck?" "They're humans. One of them is anyway. One of 'em's the old Muff Potter's voice." "No, it can't be, is it?" "I bet I'd know it. Don't you stir, no budge. He won't notice us. He's drunk, likely, and same as usual." "All right, here comes the other. Say, Huck, I know that voice too. It's Injun Joe." "That's so. I'd rather it were devils. What can they be up to?" The whispering stopped, for the 3 men had reached the grave of Hoss Williams and stood within a few feet of the boys' hiding place. "Here it is," said the third man, and held up the lantern and showed the face of the young Dr. Robinson. Potter and Injun Joe were carrying a wheelbarrow with a rope and a couple of shovels on it. They put down their load and began to dig open the grave. The doctor put the lantern at the head of the grave and came and sat down with his back against one of the trees that the boys were leaning on. He was so close the boys could have touched him. "Hurry, men," he shouted in a low voice. "The moon might come out at any moment." They growled and answered and went on digging. For a time there was no noise except the digging, and then a scraping, and at last the coffin was brought up and torn open, and the body dumped out. The moon drifted from behind the clouds and showed the white, dead face. The men put the body in a barrow, covered it with a blanket, and tied it down with a rope. Potter then said, "Now it's ready, Sawbones," talking to the doctor. "You'll just out with another $5, or here the body stays." "That's the talk," said Injun Joe. "Look here, what does this mean?" said the doctor. "You required your pay in advance, and I've paid you." "Yes, you did more than that," said Injun Joe, approaching the doctor, who jumped up. "5 years ago, your father had put me in jail after you told him I was at your house for no good reason that night. I came to your house to ask for something to eat. I was hungry. Did you forget that? I've got you now, and you've got to settle, you know." He threatened the doctor with his fist, and the doctor struck out suddenly and knocked him to the ground. Potter exclaimed, "Here now, don't you hit my friend!" The next moment, Potter was fighting with the doctor. The two struggled with might and main. Injun Joe sprang to his feet, picked up the long knife Potter had dropped after cutting the rope, and went creeping like a cat around the fighters. All at once, the doctor flung himself free, seized a heavy board from the ground, and knocked Potter down. The same instant, Injun Joe saw his chance and drove the knife into the end of its blade into the doctor's chest. The doctor swayed and fell partly upon Potter, flooding him with his blood. At the same moment, the cloud blotted out the moon and this dreadful scene. The two boys, who had been hiding behind the trees, sped away in the dark. Presently, when the moon came out again, Injun Joe was standing over Potter and the doctor. The doctor murmured something that couldn't be understood, and then gave a long grasp or two, and was still. Injun Joe muttered, "That's settled." Then he robbed the doctor's body. After that, he put the knife in Potter's hands and sat down on the broken coffin. 3, 4, 5 minutes passed. Then Potter began to stir and moan. He felt the knife in his hand, raised it and looked at it, and let it fall with a shudder. Potter sat up, pushing the doctor's body from him, gazed at it, and then turned around all mixed up. "Lord, Joe, how is it?" he asked. "It's a dirty business," said Injun Joe without moving. "What did you do it for?" Muff Potter was in shock. I never did it," he said. "Look here. That kind of talk won't wash." Potter trembled and grew white. "I had no business drinking tonight, and it's in my head yet. It's all muddled. I can't remember hardly anything. Tell me, Joe, honest now. Did I do this? I never meant to. Tell me how it was, Joe." "Why, you two were fighting, and he hit you with a board, and you fell flat. Then you come up, reeling and staggering, and you pick up the knife and jam it into him, just as he hit you with another clip. And here you've laid until now." "Oh, I didn't know what I was doing," said Muff. It was all on account of the whiskey and the excitement. I think I've never used a knife before to take a life. Joe, don't tell me. Say you won't tell, Joe. You won't tell, will you, Joe?" Potter dropped to his knees before the real murderer and clasped his hands, begging. "No, you've always been fair and square with me, Muff Potter. I won't go back on you. I won't tell." "Oh, Joe, you're an angel. I'll bless you for this for the longest day I live." Potter began to cry. Injun Joe said, "Come on now, that's enough. You go off that way, and I'll go on this way. Move on now, and don't leave any tracks behind." Potter started at a trot that quickly increased to a run. Injun Joe stood looking after him for a while, then muttered to himself, If he has much stunned by the fight and the whiskey as he looks, he won't think of the knife till he's way far gone, and he'll be too afraid to come back after it, chicken heart. 2 or 3 minutes later, the murdered doctor, the broken coffin, the open grave, and the body in the wheelbarrow under the blanket were seen by no one but the moon. All was quiet and still again.